Hi everyone, thank you for joining us for this Wildlife Wednesday Hangout on Air. My name is Lacey Caruthers and I'm on the Google.org team, where we support entrepreneurs and innovators that are using technology to address big global challenges. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by some of our partners working on wildlife conservation. We have with us, and if you guys could just wave, Crawford Allan, who is the Senior Director of Conservation at the World Wildlife Fund, Jonathan Baillie, Conservation Director at the Zoological Society of London, and David Schindel, Executive Secretary of the Consortium for the Barcode of Life, which is a project of the Smithsonian Institution. So today we're going to be talking about wildlife crime, why it's on the rise, and how technology, and these groups in particular, are using it to fight this growing problem. So we're just going to jump right in and begin the discussion. And for our viewers, you can submit questions on the event page as we go, and we'll answer some of them later in the Hangout. So Crawford, let's start with you. Wildlife poaching has increased dramatically in the last few years. Between 2007 and 2012, for instance, rhino poaching increased by 5,000%. And last year it's estimated that 30,000 elephants were killed. What's behind this increase, and what's the general state of wildlife crime today?
Well, thank you, Lacey, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It is a sad state of affairs right now. We've never seen a situation like this with wildlife crime, poaching and trafficking reaching such unprecedented levels. I would say if you had to put it in a nutshell, what's really driving this, I would say it was greed, I would say it was pride, vanity, and also some very clever marketing by criminal networks that have moved in on the wildlife trade and realized that it really is a very high profit and very low risk business for them. They can make an absolute fortune, and the prices of wildlife products, like for example this very attractive but unfortunately very deadly ivory bracelet and bangle, have skyrocketed through the roof in many markets around the world, in Asia and in China and even here in the US, where there is a massive demand now for products like ivory and for rhinoceros horn, where rhino horn, for example, is worth its weight in gold. I would say that, you know, the situation is becoming untenable, but we are seeing a very positive response from world leaders and from organizations around the world, and even from the private sector, with investment and support from a number of partners. I think that it's really clear now that with a $10 billion industry in terms of black market industry for wildlife crime, something serious has to happen to change, and we're seeing those moves happening right now.
And Jonathan, the Zoological Society of London, for which you are the Director of Conservation, works closely with the communities that live in or near the habitats of these threatened species where many of these animals are being poached. For example, ZSL works with coastal communities in the Philippines, logging communities in Cameroon, and all around the world. How do conservation practices benefit these local communities?
So we work in over 50 countries around the world, and we're working with local communities to help sustainably manage species and ecosystems. And this is important because local communities really depend on species and ecosystems. And this can be illustrated in the recent
Jonathan, I think we might have lost your audio. Jonathan, I think we might have lost your audio. We're having a hard time hearing you. So let's move on to our next question. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the technologies that you guys are using in the field to address the problem of wildlife crime. So David, you've been using DNA barcoding to identify certain species and better track illegally trafficked wildlife products. What is DNA barcoding, and how does that play a role in preventing and detecting wildlife crime?
Thanks, Lacey, and thanks for having me on this Hangout. I'm speaking to you from the National Museum of Natural History in Washington. It's one of the largest natural history museums in the world, and it's filled with specimens that taxonomists, ecologists need to be able to identify. And one of the technologies that has really grown rapidly in the last 10 years is called DNA barcoding. It's the use of a very small part of the genome that evolves at just the right rate to be able to tell species apart. It's like the universal product code on things on a supermarket shelf. So by sequencing this 650 base pair region of the genome, we can tell something from a very tiny amount of tissue. Now, why is that important? This grew up as a research tool for academic science, but it also has applications in forensics and regulation. So a lot of the things that are poached and trafficked are done in masked form. It's easy to tell that an elephant tusk came from an elephant or a complete rhino horn came from a rhino, but as things are ground up to sell as medicinal powders, the only thing left in them to identify is the DNA. And there's a whole range of products that are trafficked in masked form to evade detection and prosecution. And that's where barcoding comes in. We're putting this tool in the hands of police, environmental enforcement agencies to allow them to confiscate and prosecute based on evidence that they couldn't use before, like red meat. Bushmeat is a big problem around the developing world. Once the meat has been removed from bone and skin, it's very difficult to identify, but a couple of hours of laboratory procedure using DNA barcoding, comparing it to the reference library we're building of endangered species, allows the police now to have good evidence they can take into court. How is this going to help? There's building on what Crawford said, the growth of illegal trafficking and poaching is evidence of a shift of the risk-benefit. The benefits have gotten very high and the risks have remained very low. Risk of detection, arrest, prosecution. Technologies like barcoding are increasing the probability of detection and successful prosecution. Crime networks over time are going to have to recalculate whether it's really worth the risk to use wildlife as an ATM machine for withdrawing cash from illegal activities.
Great. And so Crawford, while David's work is addressing these products once they've made it to market, you guys are using technologies in the field to try to prevent the initial act of poaching from happening. And you're already working with the Nepalese government to use unmanned aerial vehicles to monitor wildlife and stop poaching. What other technologies is WWF using in your wildlife crime technology project?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I just came back from Namibia, where we're working there with the Namibian government too under this wildlife crime technology project, thanks to a Google Global Impact Award. It was just a phenomenal trip. We were using unmanned aerial vehicles, what I like to call flying robots, rather than the more common term everyone's familiar with, to integrate, to use this as the linchpin of technology to integrate aerial surveillance using thermal imaging cameras, a live video stream, which gives a heat signature and detects poachers, detects campfires, detects hot vehicles in the night, because poachers own the night. They're getting out ahead of the rangers. They're cutting them off. They're ambushing them. There's a huge landscape where these rangers are trying to try and intercept these poachers, and we need something to help them cover the ground more properly and effectively. So what we've done is we've set up this system of aerial vehicles that have on them a series of different sensors and detectors, and they relay that data back to a live feed ground control station that can send out the rangers, because we know where the poachers are and they can get in there between them and the animals. The other thing is that on board this UAV you've got a detection system that actually is picking up the signals from special tags that are implanted in, say, a rhino's horn or from a collar around an elephant's neck that tells us where those animals are on the ground in that protected area, and that information can get relayed as well back to the UAV. When it picks up the signals, relays it back to the ground control. So in combination of that, we also put these tags on ranger patrol vehicles and in rangers' backpacks, so we know where our rangers are. So at all times, you're triangulating data of where the poachers are, where the rangers are, where the wildlife are, and you can therefore control your base operations in real time in the middle of the night in these very difficult, dangerous situations to make sure that rangers are coming out on top and that animals are kept alive and rangers are kept alive. It's been really effective. It was a stunning trip. We even had a very close encounter with a leopard that tried to get up close and take a really close look at the UAV that was being flown. I turned around me and 50 feet away there was a leopard that had been stalking me. It was phenomenal. I can't wait to show you the videos, but we really think this is making a major difference, and combining that with a thing called a radio frequency mesh network that relays the data into a central station in a secure and encrypted way, we think we've got a really strong solution to help poachers now.
Great. And Crawford, how has that changed the way that that patrols are happening on the ground, given how resource-strapped they typically are?
Yeah, so what happens with this data when it comes in from the different sensors, the different technology out there? It comes in also from radio-linked static cameras around water holes as well. It all feeds into a centralized system, and it's going into a system called SMART. Now, this is a system for smart patrolling, if you like, whereby you can really decide where do you want to send your rangers, where do they need to patrol. You've got to make sure that they aren't doing the same thing day in and out, and that they're really doing their jobs and they're really getting out there. And you have to randomize patrolling as well to keep ahead of the poachers so they don't get used to what you're doing. So the data feed from the UAV comes in, the data feed from the ranger patrols comes in, the location data of the animals comes in there, and also the live feed images from, say, water holes is coming in. And you can then, on, say, a weekly basis, decide how you can be the most cost effective with your very, very, very limited resources for enforcement patrolling to get the best results possible. And it's a really great holistic package that brings it all together as a management tool, an analytic piece of tech, software based, that really is going to make a major difference. It's just incredible how the software is going to be one of the greatest tools we've got in the fight against wildlife crime.
And Jonathan, I think we have your audio back. ZSL is also using a type of remote sensing or unmanned technology to track poachers and endangered species. And one very prominent tool has been the next generation camera trap. Can you describe that project and progress on those efforts?
Sure. So the very basic problem is we have these very small teams responsible for massive areas, and they just don't have the capacity to actually cover them. And the species are becoming more and more valuable, and people can essentially just walk in and take them away. So what we want to do is figure out how you revolutionize monitoring, how you revolutionize surveillance, and how you revolutionize public engagement. And that's really what we're trying to do with this new technology. It's basically putting an alarm system on the world's protected areas, and it's helping us to better monitor species in these protected areas. So how it works is there's a camera, but it's much more than a camera. It's really a remote monitoring unit, which sits in the field. There's multiple units, and as a person walks by, it'll take an image and send it right to your phone. But it'll also pick up sound. It can triangulate on a gunshot, or it could pick up if a vehicle goes by using seismic sensors. So it's going to completely change the amount of eyes on the field, and it'll also help us develop an inventory of what's out there. And it also complements SMART, which was just being spoken about. So this technology with the drones and with the remote monitoring units on the ground combined together with SMART is going to completely change the game. And I've just come back from Kenya, where we've been testing the first version of Instant Wild on the ground, and it's working wonderfully. And images are coming back via satellite from Kenya all the way to London. So very exciting about the progress and the capability of this new technology.
And you all are also using this technology to engage consumers in population monitoring of wildlife species. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yes, so anyone can download Instant Wild. It's a free app on the iPhone, and they can just pick it up, and they can help identify species. So an animal walks by a camera trap. There's cameras all over the world. It comes to the phone, and then the public can look at the image, and they can scroll through and see a number of potential animals it might be, and they help us identify that creature. Now that takes us hundreds of hours of identification time to go through all these images coming in. But when the public does it, it happens immediately. And when 80% of people say it's a lion, then it's pretty obvious it's a lion.
And this type of advance is going to completely transform the way that we actually monitor species in the field, but also gets people involved and makes them realize these amazing creatures that are all over the world.
Great. And David, back to you. As a DNA and identification specialist, if we can't catch poachers in the field, how can we make sure that their products don't get to market?
Well, yeah, it's important to remember that even though most of the attention is on large mammals, like the projects you just heard about, very important, but there are over 30,000, 35,000 endangered species that are regulated by international treaty, and half of those are plants. So our project is focusing on 2,000 and two countries we're identifying now. And we have what are the most endangered species that they want help identifying and prosecuting. And they picked half of them are plants. So we feel that their rangers, the reaction we've gotten from their rangers is finally we have a way of identifying the things identify what the thing was, though they suspected it was ground up rhino horn or tiger bone that had been ground up, or medicinal plants that are rare and endangered being sold as roots or seeds. Finally, DNA barcoding has a way of identifying them. Now several of these countries are in the process of greatly increasing the penalties for being caught with illegal possession of these endangered species. Kenya just finalized their law increasing the penalty for poaching, some of them up to life imprisonment. So that's really going to shift that cost-benefit analysis I spoke of before. If we increase the risks of detection and prosecution, increase the penalties for guilty verdicts, we're really going to make international crime networks rethink whether it's worth the risk to be taking advantage of wildlife.
Great, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the human side of conservation. And Jonathan, you were speaking about this a bit earlier. Could you talk a little bit about how the communities are benefiting from these conservation practices, but also the impact of poaching and wildlife crime on these communities and these people?
Well, a lot of communities are dependent on the wildlife for their livelihoods, and especially in countries like Kenya, where you have ecotourism models where that wildlife may be subsidizing the schools, it may be subsidizing the health system, and is really central to the community. So there are massive benefits. On the other side, these organized crime rings that we're seeing are not just dealing in wildlife. They're also often dealing in trafficking arms and trafficking drugs and trafficking people, and they're essentially destabilizing the rule of law. And nobody wants these networks around. Nobody wants these people coming into their communities and destabilizing them. So when we can deal with wildlife crime, which is one component of that, we help to really address a much bigger issue. And personally, on the ground in the DRC, we've seen rebel groups which are basically subsidized by both charcoal burning and ivory poaching. And they've gone in and done horrific things to local communities. They've taken children and kidnapped them. They've killed people. They've basically destabilized entire regions. And it's horrific, the impact that they can have. And again, dealing with where they're getting their money, which is the ivory and the charcoal, we can quickly help to bring a stop to this.
Great, and how about on the first part of my question around the work that you guys are doing in these local communities to involve them in the conservation efforts and empower them to have a stake in protecting these resources? Oh, we may have lost you again, Jonathan. All right, we'll come back to that. So a question.
I missed part of that question.
Okay, I was asking. It was an earlier question about the work that you all are doing in these communities to address some of the impact that poaching is having there, and empowering the communities to have a stake in the sustainable management of their natural resources.
Yes. So I've just come back from working with a Maasai community which has implemented SMART, which is the technology that was just referred to earlier. And that's enabled them to really understand where all the animals are found in their landscape and how they can best do patrols to actually manage them into the future. And they're particularly concerned about this because there is tourism associated with their group ranch. And if these animals disappear, their very livelihoods will be at stake. So they're extremely pleased to see these new tools, this new technology, and being able to both survey the area and protect it. And often it's people coming in from the outside that have nothing to do with their communities that are coming and taking their animals that are extremely valuable. And we want to empower them to manage their own natural resources and to benefit from them.
Great. So shifting gears a little bit, and a question I'll pose to the group. Between all of you, you've seen dozens of countries fighting trafficking in the field, both on the demand and supply side. What are these countries doing to stop wildlife crime, and what does the work of field rangers look like today?
Well, I could comment on the demand side if you like.
Great.
Certainly, just to say that you know, we've heard a little bit about what's going on with rangers, but on the demand side, I mean, there is a fight that's going on out there in terms of trying to stop the illicit supply of wildlife reaching those demand markets. And when you think that there are massive numbers of illegal shipments flooding into these markets around the world on an annual basis. For example, 27 tons of elephant ivory alone in 2011 was smuggled to Asia from Africa, just in 18 different shipments in large freight containers. A lot of work is going into trying to use technology to, and also more basic things like sniffer dogs, to try and detect and intercept the needle in the haystack, if you like, of that one sea container amongst millions that's coming into ports around the world. So there's a great deal of time and effort being done in trying to boost law enforcement efforts. We're trying to help with that. WWF and Traffic have got various programs of trying to intercept these systems and to understand them and to monitor what's going on so that we can direct effort and resources. And of course, then in the domestic markets themselves, many governments are trying to deal with the sales side of things, and they're trying to put in place incentives to dissuade people from being part of the problem. And I think increasingly governments are slow to pick up on using social media, but they are moving towards that with the help of many organizations like our own. And we're trying to build a movement. We're trying to build a community of people that can really come together and understand the challenges and find the solutions together. You know, simply by talking about it, not purchasing the wrong thing, and advocating and being activists. That's one element I'd just like to touch upon before we talk perhaps about the poaching and ranger side of things.
Yeah, I mentioned the increase of penalties, legal penalties, beefing up law enforcement on the prosecution side. Each of the countries we're working with is now talking about building first-time wildlife forensic labs where they can do real crime scene investigation on the kind of wildlife crime that Crawford was describing. But the demand side is really key, and we can't talk about that enough. Consciousness raising about the various uses of endangered species, and it's not just elephant ivory and rhino horn. It's medicinal plants. The pet trade is a huge source of demand. Ornamental flowers and plants are stripping wild lands of very important species. And countries are, to varying degrees, trying to raise awareness that it does make a difference about taking things from the wild versus building new businesses. So these are potential enterprises to cultivate some of these rare species, sell them legally. So there are real opportunities that countries are trying to pursue.
I think some of the countries that are being most heavily hit are obviously the countries that have the least resources. And you know, we can do all these different things, but there is a crisis, and fundamentally we need enough boots on the ground, and we need the resources for the actual rangers to have at least a level playing ground. We have helicopters coming in with organized crime, people with AK-47s, and they're dealing with weapons from the Second World War, if that, and very small teams. So the major thing that needs to be done on the ground is making sure that we actually have the capacity to respond. Once we have that in place, then all these additional things like the technology and the legal structures and everything else that are essential in addressing illegal wildlife crime have a role to play. But without that fundamental people on the ground, which we can't forget, we have no way of winning.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So let's take a few questions that our viewers have posed to all of you. So first, a question from Giuseppe around what your groups are doing, what information and education efforts you guys are undertaking in these communities to educate folks on these particular issues.
Well, I can talk a little bit about what WWF's doing in some countries where, you know, in countries like Nepal and in Namibia, there are very, very tight-knit communities where we work very collaboratively with them, hand in hand as partners. We are local people, we are part of the community, we're accepted as such. And our teams in Nepal and Namibia, for example, have set up systems by which there is empowerment of those communities to fight back against illegal poaching and trafficking and trade, to form initiatives where they can give information about what they've heard. So, for example, in Namibia, within the past year, 5 rhinos have been poached within that country. 4 of those rhinos were poached within what's called the communal conservancies, the community-based lands that are owned by communities. And within 24 hours, those communities had identified the poachers in each of those cases, in those 4 different communal conservancies, and had brought them to justice. There was one other place that was on a private land where where the poacher is still at large. And of course, that community network, that community support is absolutely vital. It forms many, many different layers of protection for wildlife, but one of which is important for enforcement is that feeding of information, forming what communities networks of information about what's going on the ground, and alerting the authorities and the ranger patrols to any suspicious activity, and supporting them, and then feeding that information into the sort of the networks based around the markets and the traders, and that sort of intelligence-based work is really critical, and bringing together this whole picture about what is going on so that there can be much more strategic action and pinpoint action taken to combat it.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I completely agree with that. It's the intelligence on the ground and getting the community support, which is absolutely essential. And the other location mentioned was Nepal. And in Nepal, you have Bardia, where there's been a strong effort to get school children into the parks. There's been large educational programs in the schools. There's been plays put on, and poaching has actually halted in that region. And there was a ring. It was identified. It was.
Jonathan, we lost your audio again, unfortunately. Let's see. Our next question is from Maria. Is there a list of companies or products that we as consumers should stay away from, or a resource where people can find out more about that?
Yeah, there is certainly on our website. We have a list of, we have a buyer beware campaign and www.worldwildlife.org. If you go there and search for buyer beware, you'll find information about what products should not be bought by the consumer. There's a kind of a red, yellow, green kind of system here where you've got those things that absolutely it's very unlikely they're going to be of an illegal source and you really should steer away from them. And then you've got those where it's a little bit more of a gray area, and then you've got those things where absolutely, you know, these things that are okay to buy. So, you know, for example, we've got this issue with ivory trade right now, and it is a big concern. And there is legal trade in ivory around the world in, say, antique ivory, but unfortunately there is a lot of unscrupulous traders that are carving ivory to look like antique and sell it on the market, sell it through internet websites, even here in the US. So you have to be really careful what you do. There's a lot of resources out there. Our website is one of them. The traffic.org website's another. There's plenty of other organizations out there working on this. There may be local groups you can work with too, but the ultimate message, if you've got any concern, you really don't know exactly if this is legal or not, just don't buy it.
I want to just compliment the work of Wild Aid. It's another NGO doing a great job on public awareness raising. I recommend people go to their website. Wild Aid is doing a fine job.
Great, and I think we have time for one last quick question. This is one for you, Jonathan. Is Instant Wild available on Android as well?
Not yet, but we're looking to, we're speaking to Google, and hopefully we can sort something out fairly soon.
All right, great. Well, thank you all so much. Unfortunately, our time for today's discussion is up, but I wanted to extend a tremendous thank you to all of you, our speakers, and all of our viewers out there. We hope this was informative and helps to raise awareness of this devastating problem of wildlife crime. And stay in touch with us on our Google Plus page and our website, Google.org, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you again soon.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you, Google. You're making a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Lacey.
Thank you,
Thanks
Lacey.
all.